In order to tell these stories, I had to take a little bite, because if I tried to tell you my whole family tree, you'd be out of here very quickly, you'd be bored. So I tried to figure out little things, and sometimes it's a matter of accident. The first one, Dear Coach, is my dad was the coach at Millersville College from the late 1920s till 1962. And in the 40s, his athletes, men and women, because he was coaching women's basketball since the beginning, wrote in letters. Mother handed me, long after my father had died, a box of 200 letters to Dear Coach from these men and women all over the world, wherever they were serving during World War II. Some of them were conscientious objectors. Some of them were from Lebanon County. And I put those letters with the pictures and a little story about what these athletes' life was like on campus together into a book. And there's, in the back there's a list of the people. I don't know if Frankie Keith is in here. Probably you know Frankie Keith. He played basketball. He just died recently. That was a lesson in intellectual property, by the way. If you start documenting your family and you have all these letters, you own the letter. You do not own the right to use the content of the letter. Unless you get the authorization from the heirs of the person who wrote it, or from the person if they're alive. In most cases, most of them I had to go to the heirs. Now, some of these that I'm using for the stories about my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, my mother's and my grandmother's I own outright, because as I said, I'm an only child of an only child. My great-grandmother, who I want to write about too, had a lot of heirs. So I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to do that. I may not use the letters. I may tell the story in another way. I'm really focusing on 3 women now. The first one is my mother, and I'll tell you most about her. And that's what this book is. She was writing her diary to the woman of her dreams. That's the name of it. That title came from that. I'm not doing a Dear series on purpose. That was Dear Coach, and she was writing Dear Woman of My Dreams. Her mother was Gertrude, and her mother was Rebecca. Those are the 3 names that I'm working on now. In the case of Gertrude graduated in 1900 from Cumberland Valley State Normal School. It was a 2-year college at the time. I don't know how she convinced her farmer parents in Waynestown to send her to college, but they did. I don't have a diary. She was one of those people who would write January 1st, maybe January 2nd, and from then on the thing is blank. But she did write letters. And this is a sample of the kind of source material I have that I base this on. This book contains, half of it are the letters of Rebecca to her daughter at Cumberland Valley State Normal School, Shippensburg, and the other half are letters home from Gertrude. And from that story, plus the letters of other people in the family at the time, I'll be able to put together a story of her life. To get back a little bit to Kathryn, and before I talk about the 19-year-old Kathryn who wrote this diary, this is her diary, annotated a little bit by me, but it's her diary. And in the front of it, she said, "Don't ever read this." So that's a selling point. But let me tell you about the other 3 first, because I think these 3 women give an interesting insight into that period of time. When Gertie went to Shippensburg, it was 1898. Not too many farm women were going to college then. She wanted to be a teacher. She had a plan to teach 2 years and then get married. She did that. She married her childhood sweetheart, Harper Nisley, who, by the way, was the son of Kitty Harper from Harper's Tavern. Okay, so there are local connections all over this. There's many of them. She got married in 1902. 1903, Harper died. He was up on the roof working in the summertime, probably heat exhaustion, but back then nobody knew how to treat everything. And then she moved back to the farm, and my mother was born in January. So Gertie, as they called her, was a single mom. She never married them. So her story is kind of interesting. She became a very active teacher, very active in Elizabeth Eastern Star, Amaranth, and White Shrine, all of which she was a leader in. She was extremely busy. But these three women are kind of interesting. They were on the farm till Mother was 13. And then they moved back into Harrisburg when she went to the Harrisburg schools. Her grandfather and her grandmother lived with her. So Gertie bought this house and set it up basically for her parents and her daughter. Her father died shortly thereafter, so between 1921 and 1931, these three women lived together. Kathryn, her mother, and her grandmother. And her grandmother's diaries are a riot. I can't wait to get to that because she was really not all that happy, having come off a very busy life on the farm, and now she's there kind of like tending the fire. So I'm looking forward to writing about that. But meanwhile, Kathryn went to Lebanon Valley. And I thought you might be interested in knowing how much it costs to go to Lebanon Valley. This is the first half of the first semester of 1922. Total for tuition, board, and some music that she did is $104.50. Wow. But that's another example of the stuff I have. They kept receipts from everything. And somebody who likes to be a social historian would love to see all the letterheads. Now, most of them were Harrisburg. They lived in Progress. They were in Linglestown. It's mostly in that area rather than Lebanon. But when Mother was at Lebanon Valley, she had her pictures taken in Lebanon and went shopping in Lebanon. Had some friends who were commuting students from Lebanon. So there are all kinds of ties between these places, particularly for women, but for everyone. I mean, it was Prohibition, but they were having a very good time. And the clothes, the changes that she went through in that period of time are fascinating. If you read this, you'll read about a young woman who is trying to decide what to do with her life. And interestingly, her biology teacher wants her to go into the sciences. And again, remember, this is 1920, it's in the early 1920s. She was thinking of maybe becoming a missionary. She played a violin rather well. She was part of a string quartet in Harrisburg with the concertmaster of the Harrisburg Symphony. So she thought about that. She was active in theater. So she's trying to figure out what she's going to be. Occasionally, this is, mundane. Somebody put an alarm clock under the bed and went off at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dorm, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's a real questioning of where she's going to go and what she's going to do. Plus, there's a fellow she met when she was a freshman and he was a senior. He's now a pastor in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and he desperately wants her to marry him. The nice thing is I have a binder of letters from him to her. I'm glad she didn't marry him for a couple reasons. One of which is I would have grown up in Oklahoma instead of Pennsylvania. You can get a little of her story as you read about what's happened. Well, she's kind of just, she did not get married until she was 34. So obviously, she had some other things on her mind rather than getting married to Carl. But he was pretty persistent. Now, they took a trip that summer, the summer of 23. Her grandmother, Rebecca, took Kathryn on a train trip around the country, visiting relatives in Indiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, out in Colorado, California. They went the whole trip. They were gone most of the summer. I took that same trip 2 years ago, just so that I could try to get to where they were. The funny thing is, the trains don't go everywhere anymore. So to go to some of the places in Oklahoma, I had to rent a car. And you just can't get from Kansas City to Tulsa or that area any other way. Now, when they took that trip, they stopped in Stillwater, Oklahoma to visit Carl. And I'm kind of curious as to why. Did Mother say to her grandmother that she really wanted to see him? Did Carl talk to the grandmother and say, bring her out here? Or did the grandmother take her out there because she wanted her to see Oklahoma and make sure she didn't want to go there? So I don't know. But that's a fascinating part about it too. And I think that at the end, I do resolve some of the mystery because I have a chapter at the end. She lived to be 103, by the way. At 100, the college, Elizabethtown, had a reception for her in the middle of one of the basketball games, because my dad was associated with that all these years, and so was she at the college. The president of Lebanon Valley and the president of Elizabethtown were both there to congratulate her, and she gave a little speech. I have a picture in there when she gave that. But I took what I knew about, because we were living together, what I knew about her, her writings, etc., and wrote a chapter at the back of her writing back to herself at 19. So that's that story. It's just one piece of the archives. I assume some of you have similar material. I would suggest you deal with it. Because there's lots of fun stuff in there when you read these things. You know, you've been keeping them. And Mother kept them sort of organized. There'd be a little envelope with a string around it, or a piece of old nylon stocking. Anybody remember that? Tying things up with that? And I archived them, and I have them in binders, and I have an Excel spreadsheet. The photos are all scanned. Although I would advise, if you start scanning, think ahead of time how you're going to organize these things, because I use Apple. I used iPhoto. Apple went to photo instead of iPhoto, and everything got scrambled. So someday I have nothing to do. I'm going to try to reorganize my photographs. Now I have to search 8,000 pictures to find what I want. It's not quite that bad, but I suggest if you're going to scan and archive photographs, give a lot of thought to how you're going to retrieve them when you want them. Always title them so that you can search. I learned the hard way by not doing that, because I was so eager to scan. And I would scan them as I found them, not get them all out and organize them and then scan them. As far as letters are concerned, I have them in semi-acid protection sleeves. Someday I want to give this to somebody. I have no kids. I can't put it in the basement in the box. And I've tentatively talked to some historical societies whether they want the whole thing. It's a whole wall in my office. And it would be fun for some social scientist or historian to go through it. You may not have all of that, but you've probably got stuff that's valuable. And I would suggest talking to the people in the family about it while they're still here. And you may find some fascinating stories that you want to tell. I'd like to ditch everything sometimes and go sit in my cottage in Mount Gretna and keep writing these stories. I don't seem to always have time, but it's important to keep it alive. And one final note about publishing. And there are a couple ways. The first book I wrote in 2003, and I had a university publisher. It was about my life at AT&T. They did everything for me. They were traditional publishers. When it came to Dear Coach, this was self-published, because there's a guy in E-Town who owns the Continental Press, which is now called Innovative Technologies, and he was the ball boy for one of those teams. So he had a connection, and he said, "I'll print it for you," meaning free. So that was an offer I couldn't refuse. So I'm the publisher. Problem is, it never got marketed. So I'm sitting with, and so is the Continental Press. They've got a whole palette full of these things. So it never got marketed. This one I used one of the, you contract with them for what you want, and you pay them. So then when you pay them for whatever editing or publishing or whatever you want them to do, they'll be happy to do for you for a fee. And they have the connections to Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and they will market it to some extent. But a warning there, if you want to publish with them, and I've had two experiences, one bad, one good. They come to me all the time with ways to spend more money. I can get this in the New York Times for $5,000. I can go to Hollywood and pitch it for a movie. Well, that'll cost me $4,000. I did take them up on one thing, and that was going to Toronto to a book fair. Kind of fun, not very productive. You pay for some experiences as well as some productivity. They do put it on a website, it's on Amazon, they do handle all that stuff. And they handle getting the ISBN number. I mean, they're really good to deal with, what you spend money on. And then you're faced with trying to figure out how you can sell those books to pay for what you've already spent.
And what is the name of the company again?
Libris. It used to be a part of Random House. It's now owned by somebody else in Livingston, Indiana. And I tried to publish something else with them. I tried to republish my first book, and that fell apart. So sometimes some things don't work. And I'll probably go with them with the next one. But you learn something every time you do this. It's a fascinating process. And yes, you think about the stories that you have in your family, and who's the caretaker of all that stuff. In my case, it was my mother. So now I have all that stuff. I've got to get these stories out. I mean, what am I going to do? I can't let it just sit there. And particularly these three women, who I find fascinating, although there's some interesting men in the family too. I'm not saying they're not. Particularly that one that went to be the doctor. He ended up being on the city council of Harrisburg and ran for mayor against the McCormicks and lost. So there are interesting people in every family. I just encourage you to think about documenting those stories and then trying to tell them a little bit at a time.